Grief is expensive, but poverty is absolutely ruthless. Cindy Stone had precisely $14 to her name when the predatory lenders finally foreclosed on her shattered life. Her only remaining inheritance, a corroded chunk of metal that looked like garbage. She never suspected that rusted iron would rewrite history. The final eviction notice from Caldwell and Hughes Financial didn't come in a formal envelope, but was carelessly taped to Cindy's peeling front door. It flapped in the harsh Providence wind, a white flag of surrender on a life that had systematically fallen apart. Cindy Stone stood in the center of her living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes that held the fragmented remains of her 32 years. The house was freezing. The utility company had shut off the gas 3 days prior. Her husband Thomas had been gone for exactly 8 months. A sudden aggressive pancreatic failure had not only stolen the man she loved, but it had left behind a mountain of medical debt so staggering it felt like a sick joke. Thomas had believed his corporate insurance through his mid-level logistics firm would cover the experimental treatments. It hadn't. Now, at 32, Cindy was a widow. Worse, she was a penniless widow. The bank had taken the cars, the savings accounts had been drained to pay for Thomas's hospice care, and now Caldwell and Hughes, a shadow firm specializing in aggressive debt acquisition, was taking the modest 2-bedroom home she and Thomas had purchased just 3 years ago. With numb, trembling fingers, Cindy packed the last of her personal effects. She had already sold her wedding ring to a pawn shop on Broad Street, just to keep the lights on through November. All she had left were a few items of clothing, some cheap dishes, and a battered cedar chest that had belonged to her maternal grandmother, Beatrice Montgomery. Grandmother Beatrice had been an enigma. She had lived in a drafty, isolated cottage on the outskirts of Newport, always speaking in cryptic warnings about the fragility of the banking system and the importance of tangible assets. When Beatrice died a decade ago, her estate amounted to little more than a pile of yellowed romance novels and a closet full of moth-eaten coats. Cindy had inherited the cedar chest, which had sat unopened in her attic for years. Desperate for anything, she might have missed a forgotten silver locket, a vintage brooch she could sell for bus fare. Cindy forced the rusty latch of the cedar box open. The scent of dried lavender and stale dust wafted into the frigid room. She dug past old newspaper clippings, a pair of cracked leather gloves, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of decaying black velvet, was a heavy object. Cindy unrolled the fabric. A thick, perfectly round disc of metal tumbled into her palm. It was the size of a hockey puck, but shockingly heavy, coated in a thick, crusty layer of reddish-brown rust. It looked for all intents and purposes like a piece of industrial scrap or a wildly oversized coin. Cindy rubbed her thumb over the rough surface. Beneath the grime, she could faintly feel the indentations of an engraving. She took it to the kitchen sink, running it under freezing water and scrubbing it with a stiff-bristled brush. Slowly, a design emerged from the centuries of decay. It was a crest, a rearing griffin, wrapped protectively around a heavily stylized clock tower. There were no words, no dates, no currency denominations, just the crest and a strange jagged edge that felt less like a coin's rim and more like the teeth of a gear. With nothing left to lose, Cindy slipped the heavy object into her coat pocket and walked the 2 miles to downtown Providence. The sky was the color of bruised iron threatening snow. She pushed open the glass door of Pendleton's Curiosities, a high-end antique and appraisal shop that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The owner, Arthur Pendleton, was a severe-looking man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanent scowl. "We aren't buying costume jewelry today," Arthur said without looking up from his ledger. "It's not jewelry," Cindy said, her voice raspy from the cold. She placed the rusted disc on the glass display counter. The heavy thud it made finally caused Arthur to look up. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his vest pocket and picked up the object. He turned it over, scraping a fingernail against the rust. His frown deepened. It's iron. Or perhaps a low-grade steel alloy. Terribly corroded. Is it worth anything? An old coin, maybe? Cindy asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Even $50 would mean she could eat for a week. Arthur let out a dry, condescending chuckle. A coin, heavens no. Look at the thickness. It's likely a counterweight from an old grandfather clock, or perhaps a decorative paperweight from a 19th century foundry. It has zero numismatic value and no precious metal content. He slid it back across the glass. It's scrap Mrs. Stone. I wouldn't give you $2 for it. The crushing weight of reality slammed back down on Cindy's shoulders. Of course it was scrap. Her life had become nothing but scrap. She whispered a quiet thank you, shoved the heavy disc back into her pocket, and walked out into the freezing wind. She didn't notice the sleek, black Lincoln Town car idling across the street. Nor did she notice the man in the tailored charcoal suit sitting in the back seat, who had been watching her every move through the antique shop's front window. As Cindy began her long walk back to her empty foreclosed house, the man tapped the partition glass. "Follow her," he told his driver. "Keep your distance." The knock on Cindy's door came at exactly 8 o'clock that evening. Cindy jumped, dropping the roll of packing tape she was holding. She wasn't expecting anyone. The neighbors had already said their awkward goodbyes, and the bank wasn't due to change the locks until Monday morning. She crept to the window and peered through the blinds. Standing on her porch was a man she had never seen before. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal wool suit that looked like it cost more than her house, a cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders. His hair was slicked back, his expression professionally neutral. Cindy unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open a few inches, leaving the chain engaged. "Yes. Cindy Stone?" the man asked. His voice was smooth, carrying a faint, polished Boston accent. "My name is Rance Belmont. I apologize for the late intrusion. I represent a private acquisitions firm, Global Heritage Group." "I don't have any money to invest," Cindy said flatly, preparing to close the door. "And the house already belongs to the bank." "I'm not here for the house. Mrs. Stone," Rance said, casually, wedging his expensive leather shoe into the doorframe to prevent her from closing it. "I'm here about the item you showed to Arthur Pendleton this afternoon." Cindy froze. The rusted coin. "How do you know about that?" "My firm employs scouts who keep an eye out for specific historical oddities." Rance lied smoothly, his eyes calculating. "The iron disc you have, it is practically worthless to the layman, as Mr. Pendleton correctly surmised. However, my client is a rather eccentric collector of 19th century industrial memorabilia. He believes your paperweight completes a set he has been trying to assemble for years." Rance reached into his breast pocket and produced a crisp, thick envelope. He held it up to the crack in the door. "I am authorized to offer you $5,000 in cash right now for the piece." Cindy stopped breathing. $5,000. It was a lifeline. It meant a security deposit on a new apartment. It meant hot food. It meant survival. Her hand twitched instinctively, reaching toward the gap in the door. But as her fingers grazed the thick paper of the envelope, she looked up and caught Rance Belmont's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a disinterested corporate lawyer doing a favor for an eccentric client. They were hungry, desperate even. A bead of sweat had formed at his temple, despite the freezing temperature on the porch. Grandmother Beatrice's paranoid voice echoed in Cindy's mind. "Never trust a man who offers you a fortune for garbage. It means the garbage is worth an empire." Cindy pulled her hand back as if the envelope had burned her. "If it's just a paperweight," Cindy said slowly, Why are you tracking me down in the middle of the night to offer me $5,000? Rance's smooth veneer cracked slightly, his jaw tightening. Mrs. Stone, be reasonable. I understand you are in a precarious financial situation. Foreclosure is difficult. Take the money. Hand over the iron disc. It's not for sale, Cindy said. Before Rance could react, she kicked his shoe out of the doorframe and slammed the heavy wooden door shut, throwing the deadbolt. She backed away, her pulse roaring in her ears, as Rance pounded a flat palm against the wood. You are making a massive mistake, Mrs. Stone, his muffled voice rang out. You don't know what you're holding. It belongs to the trust. Cindy backed into the kitchen, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the counter, waiting for him to break the window. But after a tense, agonizing minute, she heard his footsteps retreat off the porch, followed by the purr of a luxury engine fading down the street. She stood in the dark, her chest heaving. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the rusted disc. It suddenly felt 10 times heavier. The trust. What did that mean? Determined Cindy spent the rest of the night furiously scrubbing the object. If Arthur Pendleton was wrong and this Rance Belmont was right, she needed to know exactly what she possessed. She soaked the disc in a bowl of white vinegar and baking soda, scrubbing away decades of oxidized iron with a scouring pad. By dawn, the object had transformed. It wasn't iron at all. Beneath the rust was a gleaming, uncorrupted core of what looked like solid tungsten or an incredibly dense rhodium alloy. The crest, the griffin, and the clock tower was flawless, laser-precise, but the biggest revelation lay on the edges. They weren't just jagged. They were intricately milled with microscopic pins and grooves resembling the teeth of a high-security tumbler lock. And on the back, stamped in tiny block letters, was a serial code, BST-044. Cindy didn't sleep. As soon as the sun rose, she walked to the main branch of the Providence Public Library. She bypassed the internet terminals, knowing that if Belmont's firm was as powerful as it seemed, they might have scrubbed digital records. Instead, she went to the basement archives, navigating the dusty microfiche machines. She searched the initials BST, cross-referencing it with banking history griffins and clock towers. For 3 hours she found nothing but dead ends. Then she pulled a reel of business periodicals from 1928. There it was, a full-page advertisement for Bancroft Security and Trust. The logo matched perfectly. The accompanying article detailed how Bancroft was the most exclusive, hyper-private financial institution in New England, catering to old-money industrial tycoons and secretive elite families. But the true mystery lay in a follow-up article from October 1929, days after the stock market crash. Bancroft Security and Trust hadn't failed. It had simply vanished. The CEO had liquidated the bank's public assets, and rumors swirled that the most elite clients' fortunes had been transferred to a subterranean vault in Boston, a vault so secure it operated independently of the federal banking system. Access was supposedly granted only by proprietary, unduplicable mechanical tokens. Cindy stared at the glowing screen of the microfiche reader. She touched her pocket, feeling the cold weight of the token. Grandmother Beatrice hadn't just left her a piece of metal. She had left her a key. Cindy counted the crumbled bills in her wallet. $14, exactly enough for a one-way Greyhound bus ticket to Boston. Leaving her packed boxes behind, in the freezing foreclosed house, Cindy Stone marched out into the morning snow. She was going to find out what Beatrice had locked away, or she was going to die trying. The Greyhound bus deposited Cindy Stone into the heart of a biting Boston winter. The city was a maze of sleet-slicked concrete and towering glass, a stark contrast to the quiet desperation she had left behind in Providence. With her last $14 gone, she had entirely burned her boats. She had no money for a return ticket, no money for a meal, and no home to return to, even if she did. All she carried was the heavy, gleaming rhodium token in her coat pocket, and the desperate hope that her grandmother Beatrice had not sent her on a fool's errand. Her research at the library had pinpointed the original address of Bancroft Security and Trust, a corner lot on Congress Street, right in the heart of the financial district. When Cindy arrived at the address, her heart sank. Instead of a granite fortress of 1920s architecture, a sleek 70-story skyscraper of blue glass and steel loomed over her. It housed a multinational tech conglomerate and a dozen corporate law firms. Bancroft Security was utterly erased from the skyline. Cindy pushed through the revolving doors, the warm, filtered air of the lobby thawing her freezing face. She approached the massive marble security desk, her cheap, worn coat drawing suspicious glances from the suited professionals rushing past. "Excuse me," Cindy said to a stern-faced security guard. "I'm looking for historical records regarding the building that used to be on this site. Bancroft Security and Trust." The guard frowned, his hand instinctively resting on his radio. "There's no bank here, ma'am. This is the Omnitech building. You have to leave if you don't have an appointment." "Please," Cindy pressed, leaning over the desk. "I know the bank was dissolved, but large subterranean vaults aren't just demolished. They're built into the bedrock. There has to be a sub-level, an archive, something." Before the guard could usher her out, a voice echoed from the end of the lobby. "Let her be Davis. She is quite correct." An elderly man leaning heavily on a silver-tipped walking cane approached them. He wore a tweed three-piece suit that looked 50 years out of style, yet immaculately kept. His white hair was thinning, but his pale blue eyes were startlingly sharp, calculating her every movement. "I am Harley Long," the man said, offering a slight, formal bow. "I am the chief archivist for the building's historical foundation. You are asking questions about a ghost, my dear. Bancroft Security and Trust hasn't existed in the public eye since the Hoover administration." "I don't care about the public eye," Cindy said, keeping her voice low. She reached into her pocket, wrapping her fingers around the freezing metal disc. "I care about the private vaults." Harley's eyes widened fractionally. He gestured toward a discreet, unmarked elevator bank hidden behind a frosted glass partition. "Walk with me, Ms. Stone, Cindy Stone." "Well, Mrs. Stone, let us see how deep your curiosity runs." The elevator did not go up. Harley inserted a physical brass key into the control panel, and the car plummeted downward, past the parking garages, deep into the bedrock of Boston. When the doors finally opened, Cindy stepped into a different century. The sublevel was a cavernous, dimly lit corridor of polished marble and brass sconces. It smelled of ozone, old paper, and machine oil. At the far end of the hall stood a massive, circular steel door, easily 20 feet across, heavily reinforced with thick steel locking bolts. When the new high-rise was built in the 80s, Harley explained, his cane tapping rhythmically against the marble floor, the developers realized it would cost tens of millions of dollars to excavate and dismantle the original Bancroft vault. The structural integrity of the street above depended on it, so they simply built over it. A few legacy families pay handsomely to maintain the lease down here. Cindy stared at the gargantuan vault door. "How do you open it?" Harley chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "I don't. No one does. The main vault was sealed in 1929 by the bank's chief auditor during a massive internal scandal. The locking mechanism isn't electronic. It is entirely mechanical, driven by a series of interlocking proprietary gears. Without the master token, it remains an impenetrable block of steel." Cindy's pulse hammered against her ribs. She pulled her hand from her pocket and held out the heavy, milled rhodium disc. "You mean this token?" Harley Long stopped breathing. His cane slipped clattering against the marble floor. He stared at the gleaming crest, the griffin and the clock tower, and the intricately milled edges. With trembling hands, he pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and leaned in, examining the serial number. BST-044, Harley whispered, his voice cracking with pure reverence. "By all the saints, you are Beatrice Montgomery's granddaughter. You knew my grandmother. Knew her Mrs. Stone. Your grandmother was the chief auditor of Bancroft Trust. She was a financial genius. In 1929, she uncovered that the bank's founding partners were systematically embezzling millions from their clients to fund illicit rum-running syndicates during Prohibition. When she threatened to expose them, they put a hit out on her." Cindy's head spun. Grandmother Beatrice lived in a drafty cottage in Newport. She was terrified of banks. She owned nothing. "She lived in hiding," Harley corrected, picking up his cane. "Before she vanished, she managed to transfer the entirety of the embezzled funds, along with the ledger proving the partners' crimes, into Vault 044. She locked the system, took the master gear, and disappeared into the wind. The partners' descendants have spent the last 90 years searching for that token. It is the only key to a fortune that has sat compounding in the dark." A beautiful history lesson? "Mr. Long," a chillingly familiar voice echoed down the marble corridor. "But the history lesson is officially over." Cindy spun around. Stepping out of the adjacent stairwell was Rance Belmont. He was no longer wearing the diplomatic mask he had worn on her porch in Providence. Flanking him were two massive stone-faced men in dark suits. Belmont's eyes were locked onto the gleaming token in Cindy's hand. "How did you find me?" Cindy demanded, stepping backward toward the massive steel vault door. "You used your real name at the library terminal in Providence." "Cindy." Rance sneered, walking slowly toward her. "You think my firm doesn't monitor these things? You think we haven't been watching your family for decades?" "Your firm." Cindy realized the puzzle pieces violently snapping together in her mind. "Global Heritage Group, Caldwell and Hughes Financial. You own the debt collection agency. You foreclosed on my house." Rance smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. "It was business, Cindy. When your husband fell ill, his insurance company, which we conveniently hold a majority stake in, denied his experimental claims. We knew the medical debt would force you into bankruptcy. We wanted to evict you, so we could tear that miserable Providence house down to the studs to find Beatrice's hiding spot. Imagine my surprise when Arthur Pendleton called me to say you walked right into his shop, holding the very thing we've spent 3 generations looking for." Bile rose in Cindy's throat. The grief, the trauma, the agonizing months watching Thomas waste away while they drowned in unpayable bills. It wasn't just terrible luck. It was a calculated, orchestrated corporate murder. All for a piece of metal. "You killed my husband," Cindy whispered, her voice vibrating with a rage so profound it felt like a physical heat radiating from her skin. "I expedited an inevitability," Rance replied coldly. "Now give me the token, Cindy. You are out of your depth, out of money, and completely out of time." "Don't give it to him, Cindy," Harley shouted, raising his cane defensively. One of Rance's men casually backhanded the elderly archivist, sending Harley crashing to the marble floor. Cindy screamed, surging forward, but the other man grabbed her by the shoulders, pinning her against the icy steel face of the vault door. Rance casually walked up to her, his polished shoes clicking sharply in the cavernous space. He reached out and forcefully pried her fingers open, snatching the rhodium token from her grasp. "My grandfather built this empire," Rance said, admiring the gleaming metal. "Your grandmother stole our birthright. I am simply correcting a historical error." Rance turned to the massive vault door. In the center of the steel expanse was a deep, circular indentation surrounded by heavy mechanical gears. He pressed the token into the slot. It fit perfectly, clicking into place with a satisfying metallic snap. Rance grabbed the heavy steel wheel next to the slot and turned it. Clank, grind, hiss. Deep within the door, massive tumblers the size of tree trunks began to rotate. The sound was deafening, a mechanical symphony of releasing pressure. Air hissed fiercely as the hermetic seal of 90 years was broken. Slowly, ponderously, the 20-foot steel door swung inward, revealing a pitch-black cavern. The security guards clicked on high-powered flashlights, illuminating the interior. Cindy gasped. The vault was lined floor to ceiling with safe deposit boxes, but the center of the room was dominated by a mountain of wealth. Stacks of gold bullion, dull but unmistakable, sat neatly arranged on heavy oak pallets. Beside them were rows of metal lockboxes. Rance laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed. Finally, the reserves. He rushed into the vault, his men following close behind their flashlight beams, sweeping over the gold. Rance immediately went to a locked box labeled 044, smashing the brittle-aged lock with the butt of a flashlight. He ripped it open. Inside were neat bundles of bearer bonds, unregistered, untraceable, and worth tens of millions in modern currency. Beneath the bonds lay a thick, leather-bound ledger book. "The evidence," Rance said, tossing the ledger carelessly to the floor. He greedily grabbed handfuls of the bearer bonds. "Burn the book. We take the gold and the bonds tonight." Cindy watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. She looked down at Harley, who was groaning and wiping a trail of blood from his lip. The old man looked up at her, and then his eyes darted toward the inside of the vault door. Cindy followed his gaze. On the inside of the massive door, right where the token had been inserted from the outside, was a secondary mechanical lever painted a faded industrial red. It was labeled Emergency Sealing Protocol. Time lock engagement. A memory of her grandmother's cryptic warnings flashed in her mind. "Always secure your assets, Cindy. The most powerful vault isn't the one that keeps thieves out. It's the one that traps them inside." Cindy didn't hesitate. She moved silently, slipping behind the massive door, while Rance and his men were distracted by the mountain of gold. She grabbed the heavy red lever. It was stiff, with nearly a century of disuse, but her rage fueled her adrenaline. She threw her entire body weight backward, pulling the lever down with a violent jerk. Crack! A deafening alarm bell shattered the silence of the sublevel. Rance spun around his eyes, widening in sudden panic as the massive steel door began to heavily swing shut on its automated hinges. "Stop her!" Rance screamed, dropping the bonds and sprinting toward the exit. But a 20-ton door does not negotiate. Cindy stepped back into the corridor, grabbing the heavy leather ledger from the floor just before the gap closed. Rance lunged for the opening, his hand stretching out into the corridor. With a final thunderous boom that shook the foundation of the skyscraper above the vault door, slammed completely shut. The locking bolts fired simultaneously, echoing like cannon fire. Muffled screams and the frantic pounding of fists against solid steel emanated from inside the vault. Cindy stood there, panting, her hands trembling as she clutched the heavy ledger to her chest. She looked at the dial on the door. The emergency time lock had engaged. It read 999 hours. "They have sufficient oxygen in there for perhaps 2 days," Harley said, slowly pulling himself up using his cane. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily but smiling. "The police will have plenty of time to excavate them, though I imagine Mr. Belmont will find the arrest preferable to suffocation." Cindy opened the leather ledger. The pages were perfectly preserved, detailing every illegal transaction, every bribe, every assassination ordered by the original partners of Bancroft Trust, directly linking their stolen wealth to the founding of Global Heritage Group. "This is it," Cindy whispered, tears finally breaking through her stoic facade. "This is the proof. This is how I tear Caldwell and Hughes to the ground." "Indeed," Harley said, patting her shoulder gently. He reached into his tweed jacket and pulled out a thick stack of vintage bearer bonds he had quietly slipped from the box before the door closed. He handed them to her. "And this, Mrs. Stone, is your grandmother's inheritance, untraceable, tax-free, and entirely yours." Cindy stared at the bonds. There was easily $5 million in her hands. Over the next 6 months, the financial world of Boston was rocked by an unprecedented scandal. Armed with Beatrice Montgomery's ledger, Cindy Stone unleashed a legal firestorm upon Global Heritage Group. The federal investigations dismantled the predatory lending firm overnight. Rance Belmont, rescued from the vault half-mad from terror and dehydration, was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for racketeering extortion and his role in the Bancroft conspiracy. Cindy didn't just buy her Providence home back. She bought the entire neighborhood. She transformed the properties into rent-free transitional housing for families drowning in medical debt, ensuring no one would ever suffer the way she and Thomas had. Standing on the porch of her newly restored home, Cindy watched the spring flowers bloom. She reached into her pocket, rubbing her thumb over the smooth, rusted surface of an ordinary iron washer she had found on the street. It wasn't the rhodium token that was resting safely in the evidence locker of the FBI, but it grounded her. Poverty was ruthless, but Cindy Stone had proven that a woman with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous force on Earth. Did Cindy's incredible journey of turning a rusted piece of scrap into a staggering multi-million-dollar inheritance keep you absolutely on the edge of your seat? The truth is often far stranger and much more thrilling than fiction. If you loved this deep dive into historical mysteries, family secrets, and ultimate revenge against predatory banks, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories delivered every single week.